Hey, can everyone hear me? Good morning, everyone. My name is James Royston from World Animal Protection. Welcome to this session on Unpacking the Emirates Declaration. Is industrial animal agriculture an overlooked climate culprit? World Animal Protection is a global organization with 12 offices across the global north and global south. Our goal is to change the way the world works to end animal cruelty and suffering for both wild and farmed animals. Our work to protect animals will play a vital role in solving the climate emergency, public health crisis, devastation of natural habitats. The global discussion about food systems and agriculture taking center stage today at the Climate Conference of the Parties, or COP, is a significant and long overdue development. The Emirates Declaration, for the first time, acknowledges the need for sustainable agriculture and food systems to be at the forefront of the UNFCCC's actions. The declaration invites national governments to align their national food systems and agriculture strategies with their nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans, and national biodiversity strategies and action plans. As of this morning, over 150 governments have so far signed the declaration. The Global Stocktake Technical Dialogue Synthesis Report also recognises that systemic transformation of the food system is needed and that demand-side measures such as dietary shifts are essential. However, industrial animal agriculture is almost always overlooked as a climate culprit within the food and agriculture sector, and this will be the key subject of our discussion today. This discussion is vital as it explores how industrial farming emissions contribute to global climate change and exacerbate environmental and social challenges, particularly in vulnerable regions in the global south. For this esteemed panel, we've brought together experts from various fields to unpack this further. They will share their insights, research findings, and recommendations to create a more humane, sustainable, equitable food system. We will start with a recorded presentation looking at the science on the connection between climate emergency and industrial animal agriculture. We're joined online by two experts in the field, Dr. Helen Harwood, who's joining us online, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, who will take us through the pathways countries can take to meet the Paris Agreement goals, and Mark Driscoll, CEO and founder of Tasting the Future, who will present this new World Animal Protection commissioned research on how factory farming emissions are driving climate disasters in the global south. We will start with Dr. Helen Harwood. May I now invite you to take the floor? Can you hear us online?
Yeah, I can hear you. Good morning, everybody. There's a little feedback. I can hear myself. I think that's better. Great, thank you. Yeah, it's really good to join you this morning. Thanks for the invitation. I can't put my camera on. Did you want my camera on?
Ideally, yes, if that's possible.
It just says the host has stopped it.
It is not possible, I'm being told. I'm very sorry.
Okay, that's no problem at all. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the background context for including livestock reduction in climate plans, followed by a brief overview of some research that we're about to publish. So I would appreciate if you refrain from tweeting any of those details when I get to the research survey. So in terms of the background context, so without substantial reductions, we know that emissions from the global food system alone would make the 1.5 degree an impossible temperature limit. Food systems account for around a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions, and livestock production alone for around 50% of that amount, despite delivering just 18% of calories and around 37% of protein to the global food system. And in one of my previous populations, I calculated that by 2030 alone, on a business as usual trajectory, greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector will take almost half of the greenhouse gas emissions budget, consistent with limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Methane is another really important gas to talk about in the context of livestock reduction. So reducing methane emissions is critical to slowing the rate of warming and would be effective over the short term. So in a 10-year period, for example, given its much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere compared to the two other major greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. The domestic livestock make the largest contribution to anthropogenic methane emissions, and that's from enteric fermentation during digestion and manure management, and that currently amounts to around a third of the global total. Another really key aspect is land use. Around 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions result from land use change, which includes deforestation and degradation. Cattle production is the single largest direct cause of deforestation, and animal agriculture is a major indirect cause due to land use change for feed crop production. Land use represents around 25% of total emissions mitigation potential between now and 2050, so clearly a very important aspect of climate mitigation plans. Currently, the livestock sector occupies around 78% of agricultural land and 39% of all habitable land. The loss of carbon sinks in the process of creating agricultural land to support animal consumption is substantial. So one analysis that we published in 2020 found that if the land currently used for livestock grazing was restored to its native vegetation cover, so that's forest or grassland, at the global level, this could remove the equivalent of 16 years of current global CO2 emissions from the atmosphere over a 30-year period. CO2 removal is increasingly important in the absence of strong emissions reductions in the short term, which is clearly the trajectory that we're currently on. So moving on to the survey, this was done as Climate and Food Policy Fellow at the Harvard Law School's Animal and Law Policy Program. And as I said, it's publishing soon. Hopefully this side of during 2024. So what we basically found is that there are no credible Paris compliant pathways that allow the livestock sector to continue current trends, and there's no time left to delay action. So the timeframes, targets and emissions trajectories needed to align with the central goals of the Paris Agreement are unknown, with this knowledge gap representing a barrier to action. So in response, in the forthcoming report, we provide the first articulation of what an appropriate emissions trajectory might be for this sector and identify whether a sector-specific emissions target would be suitable or not, and outline some potential implications of a Paris-compliant livestock sector on food production and consumption. So the results that I'm about to summarise were from a detailed survey of 210 highly experienced participants across 48 countries, working mostly on the causes, impacts, or mitigation of climate change. And just to give you an idea of who these respondents were, so around 60% of them are IPCC authors, and the rest were publishing from the FAO and UNEP and in the sustainable diets and agriculture scientific literature. So the key findings, I mean, essentially really interesting. The results align very well with the IPCC's pathways to 1.5 for all greenhouse gas emissions. So in that sense, it seems like a reasonable trajectory is being suggested for the livestock sector from this group of experts. So reducing emissions from the livestock sector was considered to be important to limiting temperatures to a maximum of 2 degrees, and that livestock emissions should be reduced as much as possible to reduce the risk of temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. Emissions from livestock must peak before 2025 in high-income countries and middle-income countries and globally, and emissions from livestock must peak after 2030 in low-income countries, and absolute livestock numbers must also peak globally. So following the peak, livestock emissions should fall rapidly in high-income countries and middle-income countries, and high, middle, and low-income countries should all have a greenhouse gas reduction target for livestock production that aligns with the overall global reduction target, which was identified to be a 50% reduction by 2030, increasing to around 61% by 2035. So reducing the consumption of livestock products and reducing the number of farmed animals were thought to have potential to make very large contributions to this target, with more moderate but important contributions coming from reducing the number of animals with large greenhouse gas footprints, efficiency gains through technological advances, manure management, and soil carbon sequestration. So very interesting and particularly relevant for this topic today is that the experts thought the intensification of livestock production would have the least contribution to meeting this target. So further to that, they also agreed that emissions reduction should not be at the cost of animal welfare and should not result in an increased number of farmed animals. In terms of the human diet, this would shift from livestock-derived foods to livestock replacement foods, with the most substantial shifts occurring among consumers in high-income and middle-income countries, where consumer diets would be expected to shift from current patterns to more plant-based in middle-income countries and to much more plant-based in high-income countries. In low-income countries, diets would shift from current to slightly more plant-based, and at the global level, they would shift from current to more plant-based. And just finally, on the survey results in support of achieving those emissions targets and trajectories, the potential options include adopting a best available food approach in climate, agriculture, and food purchasing policy, where plant-sourced alternatives to animal-sourced foods that provide comparable or better health outcomes and lower greenhouse gas emissions are given preference, and financial assistance to farmers to convert the practices away from livestock production is provided where required. And I just want to finish by saying the results that I've just run through in our forthcoming report don't imply a reduced need for deep and rapid decarbonization of the energy sector. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Helen. It's really interesting to hear the concept of livestock peaking, and I believe should be part of the wider discussion on just transition in agriculture. Having those clear policy options and pathways appropriate to the specific national circumstances of countries is a really helpful guide. So our next speaker is Mark Driscoll, who will give a brief on our recent World Animal Protection commissioned research on how factory farming emissions are driving climate disasters in the global south. Mark Driscoll is CEO and founder of Tasting the Future, and I think the presentation has been given by video, so if you could move to the next slide, please.
Hello and good morning to you all. My name is Mark Driscoll, founder and director of Tasting the Future and lead author of a World Animal Protection commissioned report, which has recently been released, exploring how factory farmed emissions, particularly in the global north, are contributing to climate-induced disasters in the global south. I'm just going to spend a few minutes highlighting the scope of this unique research and some of our key findings. As you all know, 2023 has certainly been a year of climate extremes, with temperature records tumbling across the world. We know that human activities are driving these temperature records and the intensity and frequency of climate-induced weather disasters that result. These include an increase in the frequency and intensity of droughts, heat waves, wildfires, storms, and flooding. This in turn is exacerbating global inequality and hunger. Factory farming continues to expand around the world in response to urbanization, a growing global population, and a growing demand for meat. But this growth comes with a significant cost to our climate, environment, biodiversity, health, and to the billions of animals caught up in cruel factory farms. This damaging model of livestock production, which concentrates power and control into a handful of global agribusinesses, is effectively being exported to the global south, with little or no say from those traditional pastoral, agroecological, and smallholder producers whose livelihoods will be most impacted by the expansion of this resource intensive form of industrial livestock production. The profits of some of the world's biggest meat processors and packers, who are predominantly based in the global north, such as JBS and Tyson, increasingly come at the expense of lives and livelihoods in the global south. There is an increasing recognition that the climate-related impacts of producing more than 80 billion land animals for food annually, over 70% of which are reared in factory farms, increases the frequency and impact of climate-related weather events around the world. 2023 showed some of the most severe impacts we have ever witnessed. The worst impacts of climate events are often felt by the poorest and most vulnerable communities, particularly in Africa and Asia, who contribute the smallest share of global emissions. These countries are also the most vulnerable to the impact of extreme weather events and must bear the costs of the loss and damages that result. In Africa, for example, it is a continent that contributed the least to climate change, contributing just 3.9% of global GHG emissions in 2021. However, it is the continent that must bear the most significant costs that will result, with some estimates suggesting that it will need $53 billion annually by 2030 to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Our unique research calculated the proportion of total greenhouse gas emissions that comes from factory farming and how they are split across global north and global south countries. When we attribute a proportion of the increased frequency intensity of those climate-related weather disasters that impact the global south to those GHG emissions caused by factory farmed emissions, the uniqueness of this work is less in the exact numbers, given that attribution science is still in its infancy, but more the ability to link the impacts of factory farmed emissions to economic damage and loss, particularly in the global south. This report also includes lived experience case studies of farming communities impacted by climate change, as you will see in a film shortly, and makes recommendations for policymakers. Our research is based on a nascent attribution science and estimates the economic impacts of loss and damage caused by the most damaging climate-induced weather disasters over a 5-year period from 2018 to 2020, focusing predominantly on Africa, Asia, and South America. We do recognise that attributing extreme weather events to climate change is an imperfect science and difficult because of natural climate variability. It's also important to recognise that a wide range of socio-economic and political factors have a significant bearing on the loss and damage caused by specific climate-induced weather disasters. The damage and impacts caused are inherently a function of vulnerabilities on the ground, as shown in this slide, with global south countries being particularly vulnerable. Inequality has an enormous bearing on the impacts of any disaster. So the data presented in this report will be imperfect, but nevertheless is an important step in attributing factory farmed emissions to loss and damage caused by climate disasters in the global south. In many respects, we believe our calculations are conservative figures, given the estimated economic damages of specific weather-related events in the global south tend to be underestimates of the real costs. To apportion the cost of climate-induced weather disasters to factory farmed emissions, we calculated the GHGs from factory farming as a proportion of the estimated 54.5 gigatons of global greenhouse gas emissions produced in 2021. As shown on this slide, we estimate the global farmed emissions contribute 11% of total global GHGs, and the global north countries contribute 4.2% to 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The report explores in detail over a dozen climate-induced weather-related disasters across the 3 continents. This slide just highlights 4 climate-induced weather disasters with an attribution of economic costs and damages attributed to factory farmed emissions originating in the global north. I'm only just going to highlight one here. So on the top left-hand corner of this slide, you can see Pakistan and India, which in March and April experienced extremely high temperatures, recording the hottest temperatures since records began 122 years ago. A scientific attribution study estimated the chances of exceeding the record-breaking temperatures was made 100 times more likely because of climate change. We estimate the economic costs of this event attributable to climate change were at least 157 billion, with a cost attributed of factory farmed emissions from the global north estimated at some 6.71 billion. Our analysis highlights that by 2050, the economic costs associated with climate-driven disasters globally could exceed 1 trillion annually as the impacts of climate change intensify. This research finds that factory farms could be liable for over 100 billion of that cost. I just want to leave you with this statement made in 2022 by the UN Chief Antonio Guterres, who described loss and damage as a fundamental question of climate justice, international solidarity, and trust, adding that polluters must pay because vulnerable countries need meaningful action. Leaders at COP28 must deliver a strong commitment that raises climate ambition and recognises that factory farmed emissions must be reduced while supporting the countries most impacted by climate change to adapt. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you very much to Mark for presenting that really important research on how factory farming emissions are driving climate disasters in the global south. I'm now pleased to say we're very honoured to have a representative from the COP28 presidency join us today. So let us welcome Mrs. Kaltham Ali Kayaf, Director of Animal Development and Health Department of the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, to make a few remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, good morning and thank you for joining us at the culmination of COP28. As we unpack the Emirates Declaration on Resilient Food Systems, Sustainable Agriculture and Climate Action, it is with great pleasure that we gather here today to reflect on the outcomes of this historic conference and the crucial role that it plays in shaping our collective efforts towards sustainable future. Over the past few weeks, we have witnessed intense discussion, thought-provoking sessions, and passionate advocacy for climate action in various sectors. It is pivoting that we conclude this event by placing our focus on one of the most pressing areas for action: resilient food system and sustainable agriculture. As we face the challenge of the changing climate and the need for sustainable climate and climate resilient agriculture practices has become increasingly urgent. The Emirates Declaration serves as a beacon of hope, outlining a comprehensive roadmap that will guide our endeavors to enhance food security, adapt agriculture, climate change, and mitigate its impact. This declaration is not just a statement of intent. It represents our powerful commitment from nation, organization, and individual around the world to transform our food system. It calls for collaboration and innovation to ensure efficient yields, climate adaptive crops, zero hunger, and equitable access to nutrition food for all. Today, we gather here not only to celebrate the adoption of Emirates Declaration, but also to envision the next step in its implementation. It is our responsibility as a global community to turn these commitments into action. We must work together, practical strategies, to foster knowledge exchange, mobilize our resources to support resilient food system and sustainable agriculture worldwide. As part of our completed efforts at COP, the world had secured a major win with 134 world leaders signing up the landmark of COP28 UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food System, and the Climate Action. COP28 presidency also announced the mobilization of more than $2.5 billion, impacting climate change, as well as new partnerships between UAE and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for Food System and Innovation. It is indeed a matter of pride that COP28 UAE Declaration, endorsed by 134 countries, represents over 5.7 billion people, 70% of food we eat, nearly 500 farmers, and 76% of total emissions from the global food system. We can see that food and agri-system as a center of COP agenda. Mindful of the impact of food inequality, we see several priorities for policymakers to address urgent of food security challenges. This concludes investing in promoting drought-resistant crop irrigation system and sustainable farm practices. One of the key requirements to boost agricultural productivity and investing in innovation and agri-tech. Let's build upon the momentum generated during COP28, continue to strengthen our partnership, engage all our stakeholders, and strive for ambitious climate action. Let us leave this room today with a renewed determination to create a future where our food system are resilient, our agriculture is sustainable, and our plant is thrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaltham. The declaration is indeed a historic first. It was welcomed by many organizations, and as with any declaration, the hope is that this can be implemented to achieve what it has sought out to do and make an important contribution to meeting the Paris Agreement goals and preventing much more catastrophic damages over the long term. So thank you for joining us. We've heard today more about the leaders' declaration. We've heard a number of clear policy options and pathways. We've also heard about World Animal Protection's recent research that showed that factory farming contributes at least 11% of global emissions across all sectors, is making climate disasters worse. Everyone's affected, but poorer regions suffer the most. So we've seen that we're not short of evidence and we're not short of solutions, but how much of this is being discussed openly and with urgency? It's now a matter of moving forward with concrete action. So I'd like to use the rest of the time to unpack that a bit in view of the Leaders' Declaration on food systems. And we're joined by Kelly Dent, Global Director of External Engagement for World Animal Protection. So I'd like to ask Kelly, what do you think needs to happen now? What do we need to do to move the declaration to concrete action, and how do we move governments to act?
Yeah, thanks, James, and good morning, everyone. You actually get to, see us now. So It's a good question, and I really want to commend the UAE presidency for the declaration on sustainable agriculture and resilient food. This is the first COP that's really put food at the centre, and I think that's a very big step forward. I've been coming to COP since more or less most of the time since Copenhagen, and I've seen the momentum towards food systems grow, and certainly it's been loudest drumbeat here. What I think is important in terms of where we go from here is that we have a declaration with governments. I think it's up now around about 150. That will be officially announced today. It might be a little bit more behind this declaration. So there is political will, but there are barriers in the way. What we need to see declaration translated into policies at national level. We also need to see declaration enshrined negotiations which are going on as we sit here. So we need to see that in the global stocktake. We need to see emissions reductions from agriculture. We need to see that reflected within the national development contributions, the NDCs. In particular, we also need to see a reduction in emissions from tree farming, particularly in high emitting countries, particularly in the global north. As Dr. Helen said, we also need to see trajectory towards a 50% meat reduction by 2040. I think she might have said 2030, but a 50% meat reduction, again, starting in high meat consuming countries in the global north. We also need to make sure that we see a redistribution of subsidies away from big ag and towards support for small-scale producers. We know that small-scale producers feed a very large percentage of the world. It depends on the study, but it's anywhere between 1/3 and a half of the world, possibly more. And there's a large amount of women that are involved in small-scale production. Yet, what we see, again, depending on the study, is about 0.3% funding that goes to small-scale producers. Imagine if that was increased through the Green Climate Fund, through the Loss and Damage Fund, which, by the way, is another achievement of this COP to have seen the operationalisation of Loss and Damage Fund. Of course, we need to see the money flow. We need to see it up and running. We need to see it delivering on the ground where it needs to deliver. But it is a very significant step forward. In terms of how we manage all this, we also, at World Animal Protection, believe we need to see a moratorium on new industrial factory farms, because this model of farming is not good for the planet. It's not good for the animals that are within it, and it's not good for people. It's also not feeding the world. So we need to see that reduced or cut, and we need to see the animals that are already in that system actually leading a high welfare life while they're in that system. So I think I will stop the kind of key points that I wanted to hit and pass back over to you, James. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Would you like to add to that, or should we open to questions?
Did you want to add?
I think you cover everything, cover all the sectors and the aspects. However, I believe that the power of partnerships can pose a lot and have a lot of outcomes. We saw it when we partnered with the US for Climate for Action. This is agriculture for climate. So it is an alliance between US and United Arab Emirates, and we concluded with more than 600 partners from government and non-governmental. We reached 71 agriculture sprints That means the power of partnerships is there, and we need just to utilize and mobilize those resources that we have as all. We should not work alone, because climate change or food security is not about only one nation, it's about all of us. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you very much, Kaltam. So do we have any questions from the floor that people would like to ask?
Right.
If not, then I will ask Helen online. Often the question that we hear is, can we feed and nourish our communities without industrial animal agriculture? What kind of global food system do you envision?
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, there's a really good piece of research that I will refer to here, and that has shown that feeding the world through non-intensive farming or organic farming in this particular analysis, for example, would require a substantial reduction in the production of animal products and shifts to a plant-based diet. So basically, the implication of less intensive production is less animal production overall in order to produce enough food for 9 billion people without increasing land use and other negative environmental impacts.
Great. Thank you. Kelly or Kaltam, would you like to add?
Did you want to add?
I believe in terms of the there's like a lot of innovation and technology in terms of in decreasing the demands on animal protein. We see here even in COP and in UAE, we are having a lot of shifting to alternate plant-based protein. And we did a lot of jobs that we increased the awarenesses in these terms. This will be amazing. It is not only like we are decreasing the amount of that depending on the animal side. However, it is also a more nutrition way and healthy way for people. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I mean, again, I think the point that you make, Kaltham, about the move to plant-based is also really important. Dr. Helen made that as well. I think that making sure that small-scale producers are allowed to thrive is critical. I don't think this can be overestimated. And particularly in terms of they are the ones that are close to communities on the ground. They are impacted by weather events. The principles that many small-scale producers use of agroecological principles are extremely beneficial for the earth. And we need to make sure that whatever system or the system that we move towards, sorry, not whatever system, the system that we move towards doesn't squeeze out these really vital people in it, because we can't keep going down high emissions, industrial intensive animal agricultural pathway, because we know it's not working. I mean, we have hunger already. We have malnutrition. We have obesity. It's about the production and the consumption side. So it's really, I think we can feed the world through some of the ways that we've all been speaking about here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both. We have one question from the audience, please.
Thank you so much for the speech. Doctor, I have a question for you. I didn't get your name, sorry.
I'm Kelly.
Kelly, Dr. Yep. Kelly. My question is, right now I'm very moved by your, we need to see this, all the hope that we're looking forward into our future food system. And one of the we need to see is, you said from the declaration, we want to see them to transform into policies. My question is that are there any mechanism or action plan from the declaration, from the $2.5 billion from COP? Are there any action plan to make sure to that it's transformed into policies for food systems. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your question.
By the way, I'm from China. GFIC, the Good Food Industry Consultancy, we're focusing on alternative protein.
Thank you. So I'll respond to that, and then I don't know if Kelsey might want to add to that. So my understanding of the declaration is that it's a political declaration. So governments have signed up to it, but they haven't, as I understand it, yet said how they're going to translate that into policy. But one would hope that you don't sign up to a declaration unless you have an intent to translate some of it into policy. And us, as both active citizens, but also policymakers, society, pressure and hold our governments and other governments to account for implementing the declaration they signed up to. And then I won't repeat what I said about there are a number of ways that it could translate into policy, and I can go into that in more detail later, but I summarised those before. So in terms of the actual dollar amount, I mean, Kelsey might be better placed on this, but my understanding is that is not directly about the translation declaration into national policies. It's probably more about some specific partnerships. But can we give the mic to Keltham in case she'd like to add? Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you, Kelly. One of the things that the UAE declaration or the declarations for the partnerships that happening is to scale up and the innovation that's happening around the world. So we are scaling up the innovation, we are scaling up technologies in different areas. And by this, when we are talking about even policy makers, because as a countries or ministries, we are policymakers, so we are taking those initiatives, those agriculture sprints or technology and tailor it into policy to make it happening, to implement it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think we're very nearly at time, but we'll take one last question.
Thank you for giving me a question. I'm Ashley Martinez. I'm from the University of Michigan, and I'm curious because I feel like a lot of resiliency around this, as Dr. Harwat noted indirectly, there's a lot of cultural shift that is required in order to actually implement this. But also there is the potential for quite a bit of displacement when we think about jobs for different individuals who would then lose those jobs as a result of this conversion. And so the implementation is tricky since we need to make the shift quickly given the climate situation, but also quickly means a huge amount of shift in terms of people's lives and livelihood. So are there any recommendations or thoughts initially on how to actually address this and put this into implementation, given the benefits it would bring, but also considering the humanity aspect of how much it would also potentially cause some controversial situations as well?
Yeah. Sorry.
For Helen.
Sorry.
First.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Really important question, and I think, I mean, essentially, we're asking different countries to do different things, which you've alluded to in your question. So, for example, countries that are still developing their economies and where agriculture is a big part of that, the question's more about how can they still develop at the desired rate if agriculture is scaled down or requires substantial investment to align it with a sustainable trajectory. If we contrast India, for example, which has the biggest agriculture sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, with the UAE, which has almost 400 times less emissions from agriculture in comparison and produces around 400 times fewer animal products, but consumes more than twice the amount of animal products on a per person basis, demonstrates that we also need to take consumption into account as part of the transformation. So for countries that have developed economies, the production question's more focused on how to replace that 1% or less of GDP from animal farming, for example, and how to transition those livelihoods where needed, and how to repurpose that land and restructure agricultural subsidies. So the main transformation in these countries is likely to be in terms of what's imported and what people eat. land use is also a really major aspect for some countries. So, for example, Brazil, DRC, Indonesia, it's crucial that the biodiversity and carbon stores in those lands are maintained, but that's another challenge in terms of replacing that part of economic development plans. And right now, there isn't an option to receive income from maintaining those carbon and biodiversity repositories, even though they're of global importance. So I think there's quite a few different levers and things that need to be in place in order for countries in those different contexts to actually be able to transition to sustainable trajectories.
Great, thank you. And just finally from Kelly.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add all of that without repeating any of it. We're also, like, I really wanted to pick up on your point around workers. And this is the same issue that we faced when we looked at fossil fuel phase out. And there must be a just transition. And one of the things that World Animal Protection, along with a number of other organisations in the food space, is working on is exactly that, a just protein transition. And that would also include a just transition for workers that are employed, within intensive animal agriculture or within factory farming. You're right. The problem is great and the urgency is high, but people's livelihoods also matter. And so we have to do that in a just and, in a fair manner. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Kelly. And thank you to all of our speakers, to Kaltham, to Kelly, to Helen, and to Mark. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
You.